As you know, my name is Arthi Doshi. I have the pleasure of co-hosting this event with Brian McClendon, who you'll meet again later today. I'm the assistant director with the Wilson Institute, and it means so much to be here amongst all these distinguished leaders as we move forward into today's agenda. We have a packed agenda, so without further ado, it's my honor to introduce you to our next speaker. Lester Young is serving as his fourth term at Regent at Large for the University of the State of New York. In 2001, Dr. Young was unanimously elected by his peers to be Chancellor. Dr. Young's guiding principle for his work of more than 50 years of public service has been to create opportunities where every student can be successful. A career educator, Dr. Young has served as a teacher, a guidance counselor, a supervisor of special education, principal, associate commissioner of the New York State Department, and superintendent of Community School District 13. He also led the first New York City Office of Youth Development and School Community Services. Chancellor Young is one of the most preeminent educators this country has ever seen. And he's been in this struggle for decades. He's worked at every level and has championed the challenges for facing poor children in a way that's the most aggressive we've seen in any educator that we've ever worked with. In this time of great uncertainty, we are honored to get to spend some time with Chancellor Young, who sees this moment as a time of opportunity. Please join me in welcoming Chancellor Young to the stage.
Thank you for that much more than generous introduction. Good morning.
Good morning.
It is an humbling honor to be with all of you over the course of these couple of days. I actually think this is perhaps the most important moment in our nation's history. When I think about today and what we're talking about, I go back to when President Obama announced the My Brother's Keeper initiative. And you know, sometimes we forget what he said about why that was necessary. And he talked about Trayvon Martin. And he talked about how Trayvon could have been his son. And when I sat there and heard that, it was like something pierced me, because being a father of a son, I understood perfectly what he was saying. But he said something else, that had it been 35 years earlier, Trayvon could have been him, right? So think about that. And so what we're really talking about is, how do we save the lives of our young people? This is really about life and death. And so when he says the most important thing that we can do is ensure that all young people go as far as their hopes and dreams will take them, and that we have to lock arms together and make sure that that happens, that's really the charge. But that can only happen if we provide each and every one of our young people with the high-quality education and supports that they deserve. I'm an educator by training, and I also understand what it's like to do this work under very challenging circumstances. I was introduced, and you all heard the titles that I've held, and I've come to learn that we all hold titles, but the titles are not important. What's important is what we do with the titles while we're in there, because we only have moments. And we are in what I would describe an incredible moral moment. And what we do in this moment, the decisions we make, the actions we take, what we deem important, and who we deem important, will impact generations to come. Now, sometimes when I say that, it sounds kind of daunting. But I believe, in fact, I know that there's never been a time in our nation's history when we haven't been able to accomplish everything we intended to accomplish. And part of our challenge is that we have to recognize that we operate in a system, and we talk around this sometimes, but we operate in a system that's designed for maintenance. It's a system that by its very nature is designed to benefit some and disadvantage others. And what we need when we have a gathering of leaders, we need courageous leaders who are more concerned with getting the job done than keeping their jobs. So that's why this is critically important. Last night, like the earlier speaker, you see me shaking, it's because it's the vibrations from the force of nature. I still feel it. But last night, Cecilia, I thought, did an excellent job describing the current reality. But there's something that I see in my role as Chancellor in New York State, and I'll just say, for those who don't know, we have in New York State 733 school districts. All right, think about that. So the thing that I see across the state is an electorate that is angrier and more polarized than at any time in recent memory, with many simply unwilling or unable to sort fact from nonsensical, right? Nonsensical fiction, right? People actually want you to tell children, right? You didn't see what you just saw, right? Think about it. And they get away with it. So this is a national tragedy. And what I worry about, quite honestly, in spite of the hope and optimism, that there's really little reason to think that things are going to get better soon. So we have to have a sense of urgency about the opportunity that we have before us. The Secretary and Jeff talked about the amount of money that has come into the education system, and they're absolutely correct. I've been part of public education for over 50 years. There's never been a moment when we've had this much money, but the question that I ask is, what are we spending it on? Right? How are we, because see, these funds are not going to last forever. So how are we using the money to build the kind of infrastructure so that when the money is gone, we don't lose any more of our young people? So we have to ask ourselves the critically hard questions. And it means that we have to have the courage to challenge that old normal that was designed for maintenance. I'd like to just talk about 3 reports, and trust me, I'm not going to get too far in the weeds. One by McKinsey and the other by the Brookings Institute. These 2 reports found that the pandemic has hit historically disadvantaged students the hardest, widening pre-existing opportunity and achievement gaps. Well, we knew that. Both reports found that the pandemic-related learning loss has been especially damaging to students from our most vulnerable communities. Both reports found that the pandemic, both reports revealed that elementary students ended the 2021 school year 4 to 5 times behind where they normally would have been in terms of academic achievement. These losses are particularly acute, and we know this, particularly acute in this subject area of mathematics content. Math is the gatekeeper. Math is the gatekeeper. When I go around to schools and districts, I ask, well, what are we doing about that fact? These findings shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. They simply confirm what we already knew, and that is the students who were already experiencing educational inequities before the pandemic are the very same students who have been harmed most by the pandemic. The final study was conducted by the Black Education Research Collective at Columbia's Teachers College. Actually, the study was led by Dr. Sonia Horsford. And the study found that Black and brown students returned to school with disproportionate levels of trauma, and we've talked about that. The researchers concluded that this heightened trauma is being driven by the combined impact of the ongoing pandemic and the students' continued exposure to disturbing examples of racial injustice. Continued exposure. We have a responsibility to address their trauma, and we have a responsibility to eliminate the sources of that trauma. Like me, I'm sure you've heard people say, and Jeff talked about this idea, let's just get back to normal. No matter how well-intentioned, the three studies point to something very clear, and it's this. We're not going to solve those challenges in a 5-week summer school program. And you know what I'm talking about. Everyone in America is running with this money, said, let's have summer school. And you know that that's not designed to do anything. We know that, right? So we have to behave differently. And to the extent that normal means that people aren't getting sick from an insidious disease, you know, I agree with that. And to the extent normal means classes can be held in person and students can once again learn and play side by side with their friends and classmates, I absolutely agree. At the same time, however, we know that educational opportunities are not equally available to all students. And as these studies confirm, and for too many of our young people, the old normal is a very unhealthy place, a place where people are traumatized daily by their circumstances and the persistent lack of opportunity. So we must change. And the very institutions that serve our community must change. And so I would suggest that we have to use this time as a transformational opportunity. But again, to be clear, this transformational opportunity is not about helping schools and community-based organizations improve what they've always done. Instead, it's about how we change the very nature of what we do, how we do it, and why we do it. That means, and sometimes people get a little nervous with it, that means that we have to recommit, each of us have to recommit to this thing called public education. You see, over time, we've gotten away from that, right? The secretary talked about normalized failure. The way I like to talk about it is, why doesn't it make somebody angry? You know, why are we so willing to report year after year who's at the bottom? I mean, think about that. I go to meetings at the highest level in New York government, and people sit around the room and they think nothing of saying, who's at the bottom? And no one gets angry. But even what's worse is when you present this data in communities and no one gets angry. See, we've got work to do. And it's kind of like what my grandmother told me once, you know, Lester, sometimes we have to have a woodshed discussion. All right, so we are also in a woodshed moment. And it's our job, all of us here, to ensure that we don't just mouth the word excellence, but we understand that you can't have excellence without equity, right? I mean, think about that. You know, I read something recently, New York State, and I'm from New York State, but New York State, we just passed a diversity, equity, and inclusion policy, the first in the state's history. And we did it because we felt something was missing, right? It wasn't enough for us to go and have pleasant conversations in school districts, and then we would talk and somebody would give a speech, and then I'd go away and I'd come back, and then I'd look at the suspension data, or I'd look at the dropout data, or I'd look at the graduation data. And so we felt as a board that we needed to pass a policy where we could begin to hold people accountable. Right? And you can imagine what the reaction was. Right? But we have to take whatever the decisive action that's necessary that will drive behavior. Because this is not about entertainment. Right? This is not about feel good. This is really about how we engage in policy directions that are designed to encourage people to do the right thing. That's what this is about. That's why when I heard that my friends from Poughkeepsie were going to be here from the Poughkeepsie Children's Cabinet, I was so happy. And you know, Jeff is correct. All of the solutions are here. Ron Ferguson is here when you talk about cradle to career. The founder of The Basics is here. I mean, we have initiatives that work. One that I'm particularly proud of, New York State remains the only state in the nation to enact the My Brother's Keeper into state law with a budget. Right? And over the 5-year period, we've invested over $100 million to support boys and young men of color all across the state. And we started, which is interesting, because when we started MBK in New York, people said to me, Lester, why are you doing this? In fact, people said to me, you know, you're putting your position as regent on the line. We started with 5 communities. We're now in 38 communities and 8 of the 9 tribal nations, right? So we're serious about this, regardless of what people say. The other point that I would make, and it's interesting, that we have to think about how we use these moments. When we were putting together our My Brother's Keeper initiative, we traveled all around the state because we wanted to hear from young people. And we had convenings in Long Island, in Buffalo, in Rochester, in the North Country, in Brooklyn. And everywhere we went, the students told us how their experience would have been different if they had teachers who looked like them and understood them. I mean, think about that. I mean, it's one thing to talk about we need diverse teachers. It's another thing to look into the eyes of a young man and have him tell you what they missed and understand that you could have done something about it. So part of our MBK strategy was very simple. We now fund something called the Teacher Opportunity Corps. We're in 17 universities all across the state, and we currently have 500 graduates who are now working in public schools across New York State. We have to do something that we've never done before, and we shouldn't talk around it. We're in the process of trying to think through how we can build systems that are actually designed to help all students. See, and I'm going to underscore all, because when you think about what we do in public education, we've designed systems for some students. I mean, how many times do I have to pick up an article and somebody only wants to talk about the gifted, the special, their version of the talented 10th, and on and on and on, right? But this is about all, right? This has to be about all. All finally has to mean all. And our job, very simply, is to ensure that we come together when we have moments like this and figure out how we do that. Now, like you, I continue to spend sleepless nights worrying about the impact that the pandemic has had. And I continue to have, and will continue to have, on our young people. So I worry about that, because this reopening, and every time I pick up a paper, someone says to me, well, there's another variant. And I keep thinking about, people call it learning loss. What I call it is, quite frankly, it's been a break in relationships, right? Superintendents and principals say things like, well, the youngsters come back, we don't know what happened to them. They use expressions like, oh, they're off the hook. They don't know what. And I'm saying, well, what did you expect? The predictability of life was taken away from them, right? And you know what happens when you don't know what's next, right? It just creates stress. It creates stress for adults. What do you think it does for children? Many of these youngsters, right at the critical moment of making a transition, they were cut off from school. I mean, think about it. Some young people left in the 7th grade, and they came back. They found themselves in high school. I mean, you know how hard that is. So the secretary talked about how some created these transitional opportunities, but it can't be about some. And that's why I continue to say the focus has to be on all. And our collective response requires a recommitment, as I mentioned, to public education and a significant investment in teaching and learning, such that every neighborhood school would be a place where we would want our own children to attend. It's just that simple. And our approach must always include the perspectives that support and build the esteem and identity of those who have been historically marginalized in our schools and in our society. Our young people need to feel good about who they are, and they have to feel good about who they are every day, not just some days, right? Not just on the days you celebrate who you think they are, right? But when you think about it, I said to some principals once, when the students come to school, they should be successful. Our job is to make sure they're successful. And it was interesting. One person in the room said, well, they have a right to fail. I wanted... But this is what we're up against. See, this is what we are up against. And I think we're morally obligated to seize this moment to redefine what is normal and what is possible for each and every young person. And in fact, when I became Chancellor of the New York State Board of Regents, I challenged my colleagues, and I said to them, what we need is a new possible for every child in New York State, and I think we need a new possible for every child in the United States. So this conference, the power of place and the convening of leaders, is exactly the right theme at exactly the right moment. If there was ever a time when we needed leadership, it's now. And we need courageous leaders. Some have called this moment a time of reckoning. Others have referred to it as a tipping point. It really doesn't matter to me what you call it. Now is the time for us to do something. And I would just close with this quote from one of my mentors. All human behavior can be diminished and made more difficult and more troublesome if we don't pay attention to what people need to function well for themselves and in relation to others. All people need justice, freedom, and opportunity. Thank you.